My name is Hilda. I'm 60 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. Just 3 days ago, my own son Damien and my daughter-in-law, Melissa, pushed my husband Henry and me off a 90-foot cliff. As I lay there broken and bleeding, I heard my husband's desperate whisper, "Hilda, don't move. Play dead." But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was when Henry revealed the most terrible truth a mother could ever hear, a secret our children had kept for 25 years. For 4 decades, Henry and I built what we thought was the perfect family. We woke up every morning in our little suburban home where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sound of birds singing. I worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, and every afternoon I came home with stories of my young students. Henry had his carpentry shop where he created the most beautiful furniture you've ever seen. His hands, rough yet delicate, could transform a simple piece of wood into a work of art. We had 2 sons, Richard, our firstborn, and Damien, 5 years younger. Richard was the soul of the house, always laughing, always helping his father in the shop, always shielding me from any worries. Damien was different, more reserved, but I loved him with the same intensity. As a mother, you never play favorites, or at least, that's what I thought. On Sundays after church, the whole family would gather around our oak table, which Henry had carved with his own hands. Richard would tell us his plans to study engineering, while Damien would remain silent, just picking at the food on his plate. Life was simple but beautiful. In the evenings, Henry and I would walk the trail around our small town, talking about our dreams, how we'd watch our grandchildren grow, and how we'd grow old together in that very house. I never imagined those walks were training for the one that almost killed me. On weekends, I'd host family gatherings where my sisters, Harriet and Irene, would come with their husbands and children. The house would fill with laughter, kids running everywhere, women sharing recipes in the kitchen, while the men fixed something in the yard. Henry was my perfect partner. After 40 years of marriage, he still brought me wildflowers he'd pick on the way to work. He helped me grade my students' tests, and I would hold pieces of wood for him while he cut them in his workshop. We were a team, an unbreakable unit, or so I thought. At night, we'd sit on the porch to watch the stars, planning our future. We talked about traveling when we retired, seeing the ocean for the first time, building a smaller house once our kids started their own families. But perfect happiness, as I would discover years later, often hides the deepest tragedies. When Richard turned 20, something changed in our family. He began to argue with Damien about things I didn't understand. I'd hear them whispering in the hallway, and they'd fall silent when I appeared. Henry told me it was just brotherly stuff and that it would pass. I wanted to believe him because I needed to believe my family was still perfect. One night in October, exactly 25 years ago, Richard didn't come home for dinner. We waited until 11, then 12, then 1 in the morning. Damien was in his room, supposedly studying, but I noticed something strange in his eyes whenever I asked about his brother. Henry went out to search for him with our neighbors. They checked every corner of town, every trail, every place Richard used to go. At dawn, they found his body at the bottom of the river gorge. The police said it was an accident, that he had probably stumbled in the dark. I never questioned that version because I couldn't imagine that the truth was much more horrible. Richard's funeral was the darkest day of my life. I wore my only black dress, the same one I'd worn at my mother's funeral. Damien was strangely calm for someone who had just lost his older brother. While I cried until I had no tears left, he remained silent with an expression that now, after what I know, sends shivers down my spine. Henry never left my side all day, holding me up when my legs gave out, whispering words of comfort that I now know tasted bitter in his mouth. After Richard's death, Damien changed completely. He became more attentive, more loving, as if he were trying to make up for something. He helped me with chores, accompanied his father to the workshop, and brought me things when he saw I was sad. I thought it was his way of dealing with grief, of filling the void Richard had left behind. How naive I was. What he was really doing was building a perfect mask to hide the monster inside. The years passed, and the wound never fully healed, but we learned to live with it. Damien married Melissa, a sweet girl from the next town over, and they seemed happy. They had 2 beautiful children, and I finally felt like life was giving us a second chance at happiness. Melissa called me Mom and helped me with the housework when they visited. Damien had inherited his father's talent for carpentry and had his own business. Everything seemed perfect again, but now, lying at the bottom of this gorge with my ribs broken and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, I understand that all that happiness was a carefully constructed lie. The first signs that something was wrong began 6 months ago when Henry and I decided to update our will. We had saved our entire lives, and between the house, the land I inherited from my parents, and our bank savings, we had nearly $200,000 to leave our children and grandchildren. It was Damien who suggested we visit the lawyer. "Mom, Dad, you're both 60 years old now. It's important to have everything in order," he told us with that smile that now seems sinister. Melissa would nod beside him, stroking my hand with those fingers that would later push me to my death. "We love you so much, and we want to make sure you're protected," she added in her sweet voice. How foolish I was to interpret those words as genuine love. The lawyer, an older man named Albert, whom we had known for years, explained the options. We could put everything in a trust, divide the inheritance among Damien's children, or simply make a traditional will. Damien insisted on naming him and Melissa as our sole heirs, arguing that they would handle the equitable distribution to the grandchildren. "Besides," he said, "you're going to need us when you're older. It's better for us to have access to the resources to take care of you properly." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable, but Henry seemed convinced. My husband, who had always been more trusting than me, accepted the proposal without much resistance. I had my doubts, especially since I remembered how Richard had always talked about helping us financially when we got older. My oldest son had plans, dreams of taking care of us when the time came. But Richard was gone, and Damien was our only surviving child. We signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember Melissa was wearing a pretty green dress and gave me a big hug after the ceremony. "Now we're officially a united family forever," she whispered in my ear. Her words gave me a chill then, though I didn't understand why. Damien shook his father's hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, as I made dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. The following weeks were strange. Damien and Melissa started visiting us more often, but their visits had a different feel. They no longer came just to spend time with family. They always had suggestions about how we should improve the house, what investments we should make, or what life insurance policies we should get. "Mom, you should think about selling this big house and moving somewhere smaller," Melissa said, while examining our furniture with calculating eyes. "We could help you find a comfortable apartment in town, but I loved our house. Every corner held a memory. Every room told a story of our 40 years of marriage. The kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals for my family, the workshop where Henry created his masterpieces, the yard where our children and grandchildren had played. I couldn't imagine my life anywhere else." When I told them this, I saw a flicker of irritation in Damien's eyes that chilled me to the bone. "Mom, you're being irrational," he said in a tone he had never used with me before. "This house is too big for 2 people your age. If you fall down the stairs or something happens, we won't be able to help you in time." Melissa nodded vigorously, adding, "Besides, the upkeep must cost a fortune. It would be much smarter to sell now while the housing market is high and move to something more appropriate for your age." Henry began to consider their arguments. My husband, who had always been practical, started talking about the logic behind their suggestions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind all this pressure. One night, after another of these tense conversations, I asked Henry if he didn't think it was strange that Damien was suddenly so interested in our financial affairs. "Hilda, he just cares about us," he replied while brushing his teeth. "Maybe we should consider his suggestions. We're not as young as we used to be." But I saw something in my husband's eyes, a shadow of doubt he didn't want to acknowledge. Now I know that Henry already had his suspicions, that he had started to connect the dots that I didn't even know existed. Things escalated when Damien suggested we give him power of attorney over our finances. "It's just for precaution," he explained, while Melissa prepared tea in our kitchen as if she owned the place. "If one of you gets sick or has a health issue, we can manage your affairs without legal complications." The way he said it, so naturally, so logically, it almost convinced me. But there was something about his insistence that made me nervous. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Henry's breathing beside me, trying to understand why I felt so uneasy. The next day, I decided to call my sister Harriet for advice. Harriet had always been sharper than me, more suspicious of people's intentions. When I told her about Damien's pressure, she was silent for a long moment. "Hilda," she finally said, "doesn't it seem strange to you that Damien is so anxious to control your money? I mean, he has his own business, he's doing well financially. Why would he need so much control over your finances?" Her words hit me like a slap. She was right. Damien had never seemed to have financial problems, had never borrowed money, had never shown any signs of needing our financial help. That afternoon, when Damien came for another of his talks about our future, I decided to confront him directly. "Son," I said as we sat in the living room, "why is it so important for you to have control over our financial affairs? Your father and I are still in our right minds." His reaction was immediate and telling. His face hardened, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of someone else, something cold, calculating, and dangerous. "Mom, it's not about control," he responded in a tense voice. "It's about love, care, and family responsibility." But the way he said family responsibility sounded more like a threat than an expression of affection. Melissa, who had been silent until then, intervened with her sweet but firm voice. "Hilda, we just want what's best for you. It's painful to see you worry about things we could easily handle." That night, after they left, Henry and I had our first serious argument in years. He thought I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where there were none. I insisted something wasn't right, that our son's behavior had changed too much. "Henry," I said as we washed the dishes, "do you remember what Damien was like before Richard died? He was different, more distant, more... I don't know how to explain it, but there was something about him that scared me." My husband stopped washing the plate in his hands and looked at me intently. In his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Recognition. "Hilda," he said in a very low voice, "there are things about Richard's death that I never told you." My heart began to pound so hard I thought it would beat out of my chest. Henry's words hit me like a lightning bolt. "What about Richard's death?" I asked with a trembling voice. My husband sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, the same table where we had shared thousands of family meals, where Richard used to do his homework, and where Damien had always remained silent. Henry ran his hands over his face as if he were trying to erase the memories that had tormented him for 25 years. "The night Richard died," he began in a broken voice, "Damien wasn't in his room studying like he told us. I saw him leave the house around 8 o'clock. I followed him because something about his attitude worried me. He'd been very strange those days, more aggressive, more resentful." My husband paused, looking at his hands as if the terrible truth he had kept for so long was written on them. "I saw them arguing by the gorge, Hilda. I heard them screaming horrible things at each other." My world began to spin. "What were they arguing about?" I whispered, even though part of me no longer wanted to know the answer. Henry looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes, tears he hadn't even shed at our oldest son's funeral. "About the inheritance, Hilda. Damien was furious because Richard was the oldest, because according to family traditions, he would inherit most of our assets. But there was something more, something about money that Richard had found." "What money?" I asked, feeling the ground vanish beneath my feet. Henry sighed deeply before continuing. 3 days before he died, Richard came to talk to me in the workshop. He had discovered that Damien had been stealing money from the family savings account. Small amounts at first, but then larger sums. Richard had proof. He'd been investigating for months. My mind refused to process what I was hearing. My youngest son, the one who had been so attentive after Richard's death, the one who helped and cared for us, had been stealing from us since before his brother died. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I accused Henry, feeling the betrayal multiply twofold. "Because when I got to the gorge that night, it was already too late," he replied in a choked voice. "I saw Damien standing next to Richard's body. Our youngest son was trembling, crying, and repeating over and over, 'It was an accident! It was an accident!' He looked at me with those desperate eyes and begged me to help him. 'Dad,' he said, 'Richard tripped when he was trying to hit me. I just defended myself, and he lost his balance.' Tears ran down my cheeks uncontrollably. 'But you believed him,' I murmured, even though I already knew the answer. Henry nodded slowly, with an expression of guilt that had gnawed at him for decades. 'He was my son, Hilda. My youngest son was asking for my help, and Richard was already dead. I couldn't bring one back to life by destroying the other. I thought it was really an accident, that Damien had learned his lesson, that he would become a better man after this.' 'And the stolen money?' I asked, needing to know every detail of this nightmare. Damien promised he would pay it back little by little, that he had taken the money to invest in a business that had gone wrong. He swore he would never do something like that again. And I believed him, Hilda. God forgive me, but I believed him because I needed to believe my son wasn't a killer. I got up from the table, stumbling, holding onto the wall so I wouldn't fall. Everything I had believed about my family, about my surviving son, about the last 25 years of my life, was a lie. 'Did he pay the money back?' I asked, although I already knew the answer from the look on Henry's face. 'Never,' he replied. 'In fact, he kept stealing. Small amounts that I pretended not to notice, because confronting him would mean admitting I had covered up a murder. I became his accomplice, Hilda. Every time I stayed silent, every time I pretended not to see the bank accounts dwindle, I became more of his accomplice. The horrible reality began to take shape in my mind. That's why he's so interested in controlling our finances now,' I murmured. 'It's not because he cares about us. It's because he wants to finish what he started 25 years ago.' Henry nodded gravely. 'And there's something else, Hilda. Something I just discovered a few weeks ago.' 'What else could there be?' I asked, feeling like my heart couldn't take any more revelations. Henry went to his desk and pulled out some papers he had been hiding under other documents. 'I've been discreetly investigating Damien's finances. His carpentry business isn't doing as well as he wants us to believe. In fact, he's on the verge of bankruptcy. He owes more than $100,000 to several banks and suppliers.' The papers trembled in my hands as I read the numbers. Damien wasn't the successful man he pretended to be. He was a desperate failure who had been living on lies and stolen money for decades. 'Does Melissa know all this?' I asked, remembering her sweet smile and loving hugs. 'I'm sure she does,' Henry replied. 'I've noticed how she directs the conversations when they talk about our money, how she asks specific questions about our savings, the value of the house, our life insurance policies. They aren't innocent questions, Hilda. They are questions from someone calculating exactly how much our death is worth.' That sentence chilled me to the bone. 'Our death,' I repeated in a whisper. It was the first time I had considered that Damien might want to cause us physical harm. Until that moment, I thought he just wanted to rob or cheat us. But if he had killed his own brother for money, what would stop him from killing his parents for the same reason? 'Henry,' I said, grabbing his hands, 'we have to go to the police. We have to tell them the truth about Richard and about what's happening now.' But my husband shook his head with a look of hopelessness that broke my heart. 'With what evidence, Hilda? I'm an accomplice to covering up a murder. If I talk now, I'll go to jail too. And besides, who's going to believe an old man of 65 who has been keeping this secret for 25 years? He was right. Do we just wait for him to kill us like he killed Richard? We're going to be very careful, Henry said, trying to sound more confident than he really was. We're going to find a way to protect ourselves, to gather evidence to... But his words were interrupted by the sound of the phone. It was Damien. "Hi, Mom," he said with that sweet voice that now sounded sinister to me. "Melissa and I were thinking, and we believe it would be beautiful to celebrate your 40th wedding anniversary with something special. How about we take you to those mountains you've always talked about next weekend? We could go on a family hike, take pictures, and have a perfect day together." My blood turned to ice. I looked at Henry, who had heard the conversation and had the same look of terror on his face. "That's a very sweet idea, son," I managed to reply in a trembling voice. "But let us think about it, and we'll get back to you tomorrow." After hanging up, Henry and I looked at each other in silence, knowing we had just received an invitation to our own execution. "The mountains," I murmured. "He's going to take us to the mountains to kill us and make it look like an accident." Henry nodded gravely, just like he did with Richard at the gorge. That night, we didn't sleep a minute, holding each other in our bed, planning how we could save ourselves from our own son. The next few days were a nightmare of terror and pretense. Henry and I had to act as if nothing had happened when Damien and Melissa came to visit, smiling when they talked about the mountain trip, nodding when they excitedly told us they were going to spend time with family. But inside, every fiber of my being screamed with fear. I knew I was looking into the eyes of my oldest son's murderers, and that now they were planning to do the same to me and my husband. Melissa arrived on Wednesday afternoon with a shopping bag and that radiant smile that now seemed like the grimace of a demon. "Hilda, dear," she said, hugging me with those arms that would soon push me to my death. "I bought some supplies for our mountain adventure. Cookies, water, fruit, everything we'll need for the picnic." She showed me the contents of the bag as if she were an excited child, but I could only think about how each of those items could be used to cover up our murder. "I also brought my new camera," she added, pulling out an expensive digital camera. "I want to capture every moment of this special day. They're going to be photos we'll treasure forever." The irony of her words made me sick. The only photos she would take would be of our broken bodies at the bottom of some cliff, if anyone ever found us. Damien appeared behind her, carrying a new-looking hiking backpack. "Dad," he said to Henry with feigned enthusiasm, "I bought all the necessary equipment for a safe hike: ropes, harnesses, lanterns, a first aid kit." Every word that came out of his mouth sounded like a cruel mockery. Safety equipment to plan our murders. The perversity of the situation made me dizzy. "Isn't it a bit dangerous for people our age?" I asked, trying to sound casual while looking for any excuse to cancel the trip. Melissa stroked my cheek with that false tenderness that churned my stomach. "That's why we chose a very easy and safe trail," she assured me. "It's a hike even kids can do. Plus, Damien and I will be there to take care of you the whole time." Yes, they would be there to take care of us until the exact moment they decided to push us off a cliff. That night, when they finally left, Henry and I sat in our living room, trembling not just from the cold, but from the absolute terror we had been holding back for hours. "We can't go," I said, grabbing his hands. "We just can't. We'll make up some excuse." "If we don't go," Henry replied in a grave voice, "they'll find another way to kill us. Maybe something that looks even more accidental, like a house fire or a robbery gone wrong. At least in the mountains, we know what they're going to try to do." His words had a terrible logic, but they didn't comfort me at all. "So, what do you suggest?" I asked, desperate to find some solution that would save our lives. Henry was thoughtful for a few minutes before answering. "We're going to go, but we're going to be prepared. I'm going to hide my cell phone and set it to record everything that happens. If we manage to survive, we'll have evidence. And if we don't," his voice broke, "at least someone will know the truth." On Friday night, we could barely touch our dinner. We knew it might be our last meal together in our house, in that kitchen where we had shared so many happy moments when we were a real family. Henry reviewed his will one more time, making sure that if something happened to us, at least Damien wouldn't get everything without there being some record of our suspicions. "I wrote a letter," he confessed, pulling a sealed envelope from his desk. "It's addressed to your sister Harriet. In it, I explain everything we know about Richard's death and what we believe Damien plans to do to us. I hid it in the place where we keep our important documents. If we don't return from this trip, at least she'll know where to look for the truth." That night we went to bed, holding each other, whispering words of love that could be our last. "If something happens to me," Henry said, "I want you to know that these 40 years with you have been the best of my life. Despite everything, despite the mistakes and the secrets, I love you more than my own life." I cried in silence, memorizing the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, the smell of his skin. Saturday dawned with a clear sky that seemed to mock our situation. Damien arrived early, whistling a cheerful tune that chilled my blood. "Morning, lovebirds," he called from the front door. "Ready for your big adventure?" Melissa appeared behind him, radiant as a bride on her wedding day, except this was a wedding with death. During breakfast, which we could barely eat, Damien explained the route we would take in detail. "It's a beautiful trail," he said, spreading a map on the table. "It leads to a lookout where you can see the whole valley. They say the views are spectacular." His eyes shone with an enthusiasm that seemed demonic. Of course the views would be spectacular. They would be the last we would see in our lives. "The trail has some steep parts," Melissa added, as if giving us useful tourist information, "but nothing that experienced hikers like you can't handle." Her comment about our supposed hiking abilities sounded like a cruel joke. We were two 60-year-olds who barely walked through the park once in a while. As we loaded the car, I saw Damien meticulously checking his backpack, making sure he had everything he needed for his plan. I saw ropes, a small shovel, and something that looked like a flare gun. "What's that for?" I asked, pointing to the gun. "For safety," he replied without missing a beat. "If we get lost or something goes wrong, we can send a distress signal." Of course, they would send a distress signal after pushing us off a cliff so our bodies could be found, and it would be confirmed that it was a tragic accident during a family hike. Everything was calculated. Every detail had been planned to make our murders look perfectly natural. The car ride to the mountains lasted 2 hours that felt like an eternity. Melissa put on cheerful music, and she sang along with the songs as if we were really going on a fun family outing. Damien drove carefully, obeying all the speed limits, stopping at every stop sign. He didn't want to risk an accident that would ruin his perfect plans. During the trip, Henry discreetly took my hand and activated the recording on his phone. Everything that happened from that moment on would be recorded. If we managed to survive, we would have proof. If not, at least the truth wouldn't die with us. When we finally arrived at the trailhead, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would beat out of my chest. The place was beautiful, with tall trees and the sound of a nearby river, but for me, it had become the setting for my own execution. Damien and Melissa took their backpacks out of the car, smiling and joking as if it were the happiest day of their lives. "Ready for the adventure?" Damien asked. And for the first time in 25 years, I saw the same cold glint in his eyes that he'd had the night he killed his brother. The trails started out relatively easy, winding between lush trees and moss-covered rocks. Melissa walked ahead of us, constantly taking pictures and commenting on the beauty of the landscape. "Look at those wildflowers!" she exclaimed, pointing toward bushes full of yellow blossoms. "And that beautiful bird!" Her performance was perfect, that of a loving daughter-in-law enjoying a special day with her in-laws. Damien walked behind us, supposedly to make sure we didn't fall behind, but I could feel his eyes on our backs like daggers. Every time I turned to look at him, he smiled with that grin he had perfected over 25 years of lies. "How are you doing, Mom and Dad?" he would ask with fake concern. "Need to stop and rest?" After an hour of hiking, we began to climb a steeper part of the trail. My legs already felt heavy, and Henry was breathing with difficulty. We weren't used to this kind of exercise, and our murderous children knew it perfectly. They had chosen a route that would physically exhaust us, making us vulnerable for when the time came to execute their plan. "We're almost at the lookout," Melissa announced. Although according to the map I had seen at home, we still had at least another hour of hiking. Her lie confirmed that they had no intention of reaching the real lookout. The place where they planned to kill us must be much closer. During the hike, I tried to memorize every detail of the trail, every tree, every rock that could serve as a reference if I managed to survive, and needed to explain to the police exactly where everything had happened. Henry was doing the same, and we occasionally exchanged glances loaded with terror and determination. We knew we were walking toward our deaths, but we also knew it was our only chance to get evidence against our murderers. "Oh, look at that!" Melissa suddenly shouted, pointing to a rock formation that loomed to our right. "That cliff has an incredible view. Why don't we climb up there to take some special photos?" My blood ran cold. There it was, the place they had chosen for our murder. The cliff rose about 90 feet above the main trail, accessible by a secondary path that seemed much more dangerous than the one we had been following. The rocks were loose. There were fewer trees to grab onto in case we stumbled. And from the top, you could see a precipice that fell into a deep gorge full of jagged rocks. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said, trying to sound casual. "That trail looks pretty dangerous for people our age." But Damien had already started walking toward the turnoff, carrying his backpack full of safety equipment that I knew he wouldn't use to save us. "Come on, Mom," he said with that voice he used when he was a kid and wanted to convince me of something. "It'll only take a few minutes. Besides, Melissa's right. The photos from up there are going to be spectacular." The way he said spectacular made me tremble. They would be spectacular for whoever saw them afterward, as evidence of our accident. Henry squeezed my hand discreetly, reminding me that his phone was recording everything. We had to go on. We had to go all the way to get the evidence we needed. If we refused now, they would simply find another opportunity, another place, another excuse to kill us. The climb to the cliff was exhausting. The loose rocks slid under our feet, and more than once I was about to fall. But the most terrifying thing was realizing how perfect this place was for a murder. If someone accidentally tripped and fell from the top, there would be no way to survive, and most importantly, there would be no witnesses. "Almost there!" Melissa shouted from above, where she had already arrived with the agility of someone who had planned this route carefully. Damien followed her and then helped Henry and me complete the last few feet of the climb. His hands on my arms felt like the claws of a vulture. The lookout was indeed spectacular. From there you could see the whole valley, the mountains in the distance, and the river winding through the trees. In any other circumstance, it would have been a beautiful moment to share with family. But knowing what I knew, the place seemed like the perfect setting for a nightmare. "Come over here for the photos," Melissa shouted, positioning herself near the edge of the cliff. "I want the valley to be in the background." Henry and I approached slowly, each step bringing us closer to our final destination. I could see Damien strategically positioning himself behind us, calculating angles, measuring distances. "Perfect!" Melissa exclaimed, raising her camera. "Now hug each other and smile." Henry and I hugged, probably for the last time, while she took picture after picture. Every flash of the camera seemed like a lightning bolt, announcing the storm that was about to come. "Take one more," Damien suggested, moving closer to us. "But this time, stand back a little so the landscape looks better." One step back meant being exactly on the edge of the precipice. Henry and I exchanged a look. The time had come. We moved back as we were told, feeling the solid ground disappear under our feet and only the emptiness of the abyss remaining behind us. Melissa raised the camera one more time, but this time I saw something different in her eyes. There was no longer any need to pretend. The mask had fallen. "Smile," she said in a voice that was no longer sweet at all. "This is going to be your last photo." At that moment, Damien lunged toward us with his arms outstretched. The plan was simple: push us backwards so we would fall into the void, take some photos of the accident, and then go down to discover our broken bodies. But Henry had been preparing for this moment. In the last second, he managed to grab Damien's wrist and pull him forward. "If we're going to die, you're coming with us," he shouted with a fury I had never seen in him before. For a moment, all four of us were teetering on the edge of the cliff, holding on to each other in a macabre dance between life and death. Melissa screamed and tried to help Damien, but the weight of all of us was too much. I felt the ground give way under my feet, felt gravity begin to win the battle. And then the four of us fell together, locked in a deadly embrace, screaming as the air whistled around us and the rocky ground approached at breakneck speed. In those seconds that lasted an eternity, I thought of Richard, of how he must have felt when Damien pushed him into the gorge 25 years ago. The impact was brutal. I heard the horrible sound of bones cracking, the sound of my own body shattering against the rocks. The pain was indescribable, but even more terrible was the taste of blood in my mouth and the certainty that this time Damien had won. This time there would be no witnesses to tell the truth. But then I heard Henry's voice, weak but clear. "Hilda, don't move. Play dead." And I realized something incredible. I was still alive. The pain was so intense, I thought I would go crazy. Every fiber of my body screamed in agony. I felt blood running down my face and something wet and sticky soaking my clothes. But Henry's voice echoed in my ears like a divine command. "Play dead." With a willpower I didn't know I possessed, I remained completely still, controlling even my breathing so it would be imperceptible. A few feet away, I could hear the moans of pain from Damien and Melissa. They had also survived the fall, but from their groans, they seemed to be in worse condition than we were. "Melissa," I heard my son's broken voice. "Are you okay?" His concern for his wife made my stomach churn. This man, who had murdered his own brother and had tried to kill us, was still capable of feeling love for someone. "I think I broke my leg," Melissa moaned. "It hurts so much, Damien. And what about the old people?" The disrespectful way she referred to us confirmed what I already knew. We had never been family to her. We were just obstacles on her way to our money. I heard movement, as if Damien were crawling toward us. My heart was beating so fast I was afraid he would hear it. "They're dead," he announced after a few minutes that felt like hours. "Both of them have their eyes open, but they're not breathing." His lie filled me with a strange hope. If he believed we were dead, maybe we would have a chance. "Perfect," Melissa whispered with a satisfaction that chilled my blood. "It worked just like we planned." "Well, except for the part where we fell, too." I heard her bitter laugh. "At least we won't have to pretend we love them anymore." For the next few minutes that felt like an eternity, Damien and Melissa discussed their situation. Both were injured, but they could move. The plan now was to crawl until they found a place from which they could call for help and then tell the story of how they had miraculously survived a tragic accident that had killed their poor grandparents. "Remember the story," Damien said to Melissa. "We were taking pictures when a rock came loose under Dad's feet. He tripped, and trying to grab on, he pulled Mom with him. We tried to help, but we fell too. It's important that our stories match." "I know," Melissa replied. "We've practiced this 100 times. We're the traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. Poor us. We lost our dear in-laws in a horrible accident." Her performance was so convincing that if I hadn't lived the truth, I would have believed every word. Gradually, their voices faded as they crawled toward what they hoped would be their salvation. When silence finally fell, Henry whispered my name so low I could barely hear it. "Hilda, are you okay?" I answered in the same whisper, confirming that I was alive but terribly injured. "My left leg is broken," he told me in a voice choked with pain, "and I think I have a few fractured ribs. What about you?" I did a mental inventory of my body. I felt a stabbing pain in my right arm. My head throbbed as if someone were hitting it with a hammer, and there was definitely something wrong with my shoulder. But I was alive, and that was more than I had hoped for. "We're bad, but we're alive," I whispered. It works, but there's no signal down here. That was the most terrifying part of our situation. We were alive but trapped at the bottom of a gorge, injured, and with no way to communicate with the outside world. If no one came to look for us, we would die here slowly from thirst, hunger, or our wounds. "Henry," I whispered, "before it's too late, I need you to tell me everything. Everything that really happened the night Richard died." My husband sighed deeply, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 25 years. "That night," he began in a trembling voice, "Richard came to find me in the workshop. He was furious. He had papers in his hands, bank statements. He showed me evidence that Damien had been stealing money from our accounts for months. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Richard had been investigating because he had noticed discrepancies in our savings." The physical pain mingled with the emotional pain as I listened to the truth that had been hidden for decades. "Richard wanted to confront Damien that same night," Henry continued. "I tried to calm him down, to convince him to wait until the next day, but he was determined. He said he couldn't sleep knowing his younger brother was stealing from us." "And you followed him?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "I followed him because I was afraid of what might happen. I knew Richard's temper when he got angry, and I also knew... Well, I had noticed something strange about Damien lately, a coldness that sent shivers down my spine." "When I got to the gorge," Henry continued, "I found them screaming at each other. Richard had the papers in his hand, waving them in Damien's face. 'You're a thief!' he was yelling. 'You're stealing from our own parents!' Damien denied everything. He said Richard was crazy, that he was making things up. My heart raced as I imagined the scene. My two sons facing off in the dark, one accusing the other of betrayal. "What happened next?" Henry paused for a long time before continuing. "Richard told him that if he didn't return the money and confess everything to us, he would tell us the truth himself. Damien went berserk. He yelled that Richard had always been the favorite, that he had always had everything easy, that it was time for things to change." And then Henry's voice broke. "Damien pushed Richard. It wasn't an accident. He pushed him with all his strength, deliberately. I saw Richard trying to keep his balance, saw his arms flailing desperately, looking for something to grab onto. But it was too late." Tears streamed down my cheeks, mixing with the blood from my wounds. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" Henry sighed deeply. "Because when I got to where Damien was, he was crying, trembling, telling me over and over that it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant to do it. He begged me not to tell you anything, that he couldn't lose you too." "But you knew it was a lie," I murmured from the bottom of my heart. "Yes, but he was my son, Hilda, my only surviving son. How could I turn him over to the police? How could I destroy what was left of our family?" His justification hurt as much as my physical injuries. "And the stolen money?" I continued. "Damien promised me he would return it little by little. He swore it had been a bad decision, that he had been desperate, that it would never happen again. But he never returned a single penny. In fact, he kept stealing, and I kept quiet because every day that passed made me more of an accomplice to his crime." Just then, we heard voices in the distance. Damien and Melissa had managed to find help. Soon rescue teams would be here, and our murderous children would play the role of their lives, the traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. The voices got closer and closer, accompanied by the sound of helicopters flying over the area. The rescue team had arrived, and with them came the most crucial moment of our lives. Henry and I had to make a decision in a matter of minutes. Should we continue to pretend to be dead until we found the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth, or risk being rescued along with our murderers? "Hilda," Henry whispered urgently. "The phone recorded everything that happened up there. We have Melissa's confession about the plan. We have Damien admitting that we are obstacles. We have everything. But if they find us alive now, they can destroy the evidence before we manage to hand it over to the authorities." He was right. If Damien and Melissa realized that we had survived and heard their confessions, they would find a way to silence us forever. This time, it wouldn't be an accident. It would be something much more direct and definitive. We had to wait for the perfect moment. "They're down here!" Damien's voice shouted from above. "My parents! Please, hurry!" His performance was perfect, his voice broken with pain and despair. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed he was a son devastated by the loss of his parents. "Sir, stay calm," an authoritative voice replied, which must have belonged to the head of the rescue team. "We're going to come down to evaluate you. You and your wife can move." I heard the sound of ropes and equipment being prepared for the descent. Melissa had perfected her role as the grieving widow. "I can't believe this happened," she sobbed. "We were taking pictures, so happy. It all happened so fast. A rock came loose, and they fell." Every word was a stab in my heart because I knew she would repeat those same words to the police, to the media, to anyone who wanted to hear her version of events. The rescuers began to descend. I could hear their voices getting closer, the sound of their boots against the rock, the clinking of their equipment. Henry discreetly squeezed my hand, reminding me that we had to keep up the act no matter what happened. "They're here!" one of the rescuers shouted upon finding us. "We have 2 people at the bottom of the gorge!" He approached us and began to examine us. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. I felt his hands looking for a pulse on my neck, his ear close to my mouth, trying to detect breathing. "This one still has a faint pulse," he announced, referring to Henry. "The woman, I'm not sure. I need the medical team down here immediately." My heart raced. The plan was working. They would believe that Henry was on the verge of death but still alive, while I would be close enough to death to not be an immediate threat. For the next few minutes, which felt like hours, the paramedics worked on us. I felt them put an oxygen mask on me, check my wounds, and secure me to a stretcher. The whole time I had to fight against every instinct in my body that screamed at me to open my eyes, to ask for help, to stop pretending. "The man is stable but critical," I heard one of the paramedics report over the radio. "The woman is in very serious condition. Pulse is almost imperceptible. We need to transport them to the hospital immediately." Perfect. They would take us to the hospital where we would have the opportunity to talk to the authorities without Damien and Melissa being able to silence us. During the ascent on the stretchers, I could hear Melissa's feigned sobs and the words of comfort that the rescuers offered her and Damien. "You were so brave to survive this," someone said to her. "It's a miracle that you're relatively okay." If only they knew that the real miracle was that Henry and I were alive to tell the truth. In the medical helicopter, as we flew toward the hospital, I could feel Henry's presence on the stretcher next to mine. The paramedics were focused on keeping him stable, and from their conversations, I understood that he was in critical condition. His injuries were more serious than mine, and for a terrible moment, I feared he might die before we had the chance to reveal the truth. "Ma'am," I heard one of the paramedics say to me, "if you can hear me, hold on. We'll be at the hospital in a few minutes." His voice was gentle, full of a genuine compassion that contrasted dramatically with the falsehood I had been hearing from my own family. When we arrived at the hospital, the chaos was immediate. Doctors and nurses ran from one side to the other, shouting medical orders I didn't understand. I was taken directly to an emergency room where they began to work on my injuries. I had to keep pretending to be unconscious, but I also had to find a way to communicate with someone I could trust. "Doctor," I heard a nurse say, "her vital signs are strange. Her pulse is stronger than we would expect for someone in her supposed condition." My heart skipped a beat. They had discovered me. I was such a bad actress that my own body was betraying me. The doctor murmured. "It happens sometimes in cases of extreme trauma. The body has mysterious ways of clinging to life. Let's keep a close..." "The lady, well, the next few hours will be crucial. We've done everything we can." Melissa made a sound that was supposedly a sob of pain, but to me sounded like a sigh of relief. "Can we see them?" Damien asked. "Just for a few minutes. We need to say goodbye, just in case." The doctor agreed, and soon I heard footsteps approaching my bed. It was the most dangerous moment of all. I had to convince my murderous son that I was really dying. I felt Damien's presence next to my bed. His hand touched mine, and it was all I could do not to pull my hand away immediately. "Mom," he whispered, "if you can hear me, I want you to know that I love you. I'm so sorry this happened." His words were poisoned honey, sweet on the surface, but deadly in their essence. Melissa approached from the other side. "Hilda, dear," she murmured, "you've been like a mother to me. We'll never forget you." Liar. The only reason they wouldn't forget me was because they would have to live with the knowledge that they had murdered me. But then Damien leaned closer to my ear and whispered something that chilled my blood. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Mom. You should never have asked so many questions about our finances. Some truths are better left buried, just like Richard." At that moment, I knew our plan had worked. Damien had just confessed, and even though I had no way to record it, there was a nurse in the room who had heard every word. Damien's whisper echoed in my ears like a direct confession of his guilt. He had mentioned Richard. He had admitted that some truths should remain buried. And most importantly, he had acknowledged that our questions about finances had been the reason for our accident. But I needed more than that. I needed a full confession that couldn't be misinterpreted or denied later. The nurse who had overheard the comment, a young woman named Inez, according to her ID badge, had frozen next to the monitoring machine. I saw through my half-closed eyelids as her eyes widened in surprise and horror. She had heard something she shouldn't have heard, and her expression told me she understood the implications of those words perfectly. "What did you say about Richard?" Melissa whispered, obviously surprised by the mention of the dead brother. Damien tensed, realizing he had said too much. "Nothing," he muttered. "I just meant, well, Mom always wondered what really happened that night. I guess it doesn't matter anymore, but it did matter." And Melissa was smart enough to realize that her husband had made a mistake. "Damien," she said in a tense voice, "let's go. The doctors need space to work." I could feel the tension between them, the mutual understanding that they had said too much in the wrong place. After they left, the nurse, Inez, approached my bed. "Ma'am," she whispered so low I could barely hear her, "I know you can hear me. What I just heard is not normal. If you are in danger, you need to tell me somehow." Her voice had an urgency that filled me with hope. Someone else had started to suspect. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, I moved my index finger. It was the smallest possible movement, but Inez noticed it immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered. "She's pretending to be unconscious." I moved my finger again, this time twice. "Yes, listen," she said, leaning even closer. "I'm going to pretend I'm checking your monitors. If you are in danger from those people who were just here, move your finger 3 times." Without hesitation, I moved my finger 3 times. Inez gasped, "They did this to you?" 3 more movements. The nurse moved away from my bed and pretended to check my IV while she processed what she had just discovered. I could see in her expression that she was struggling with the decision of what to do. Finally, she approached me again. "I'm going to talk to the doctor in charge," she whispered, "but I need you to keep pretending until we can protect you. Do you understand?" I moved my finger once. The next few minutes were agonizing. Inez left the room, and I was left alone, waiting and praying that she would believe my story and take the right actions. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching. It was Inez, accompanied by an older man who must have been the chief doctor and, surprisingly, 2 police officers. "Ma'am," the doctor said in a low voice, "Nurse Inez told me about your situation. If you can hear me, we need you to know that you are safe now. The officers are here to protect you." A wave of relief so intense almost broke my act. "Can you open your eyes?" one of the officers asked. Slowly, very slowly, I opened my eyes. The hospital light blinded me for a moment, but I gradually managed to focus on the worried faces surrounding me. "Thank God," Inez murmured. "I thought I was going crazy." "Ma'am," said the police officer, a middle-aged man with a serious expression. "I'm Detective Johnson. We understand you may be in a very dangerous situation. Can you tell us what really happened on that mountain?" My voice came out as a raspy whisper after hours of pretending to be unconscious. My son and his wife pushed us." The next few hours were a whirlwind of statements, recordings, and revelations. I told Detective Johnson everything I knew: Richard's death, Damien's thefts, the pressure to change our will, and finally the plan to murder us on the mountain. But the most important thing was the recording on Henry's phone. "Your husband has recorded evidence?" the detective asked, his eyes gleaming. "Yes," I replied. "Everything is on his phone. The confessions, the plans, everything." The detective immediately went to the room where Henry was being treated. Henry had regained consciousness an hour after me, and when the detective explained the situation, he handed over his phone without hesitation. "Here's everything," he said in a weak but firm voice. 25 years of lies and the truth about what happened today." While the police technicians analyzed the recording, Damien and Melissa remained in the waiting room, playing their part as devastated family members to other hospital visitors. They had no idea that their careful performance was about to end forever. "The recording is clear," the detective announced after an hour. "We have explicit confessions about Richard's murder, admissions about stealing money, and direct evidence of premeditated attempted murder against you two. It's more than enough to arrest them." "But are you going to arrest them here?" I asked, concerned about our safety. "If they realize we're alive and talking." The detective nodded, understanding my concern. "We already have officers in position. As soon as we have the arrest warrant signed, we'll take them in. In the meantime, you are both under police protection." The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Damien and Melissa were down there, probably talking to other patients' relatives, receiving condolences for our deaths, planning how to handle our funeral and inheritance. They had no idea that upstairs in the hospital rooms, we were tearing down their carefully constructed world of lies. "Is there anything else?" the detective said, pulling out a folder of papers. "After hearing your story, we investigated your son's finances. Not only is he bankrupt as you suspected, but he also owes money to some very dangerous people, unofficial lenders who don't take excuses." My blood ran cold. "You mean that we weren't just inconvenient to him?" He confirmed it, the detective said. "You were his only salvation. With your inheritance, he could pay off his debts and start over. Without you, he would probably be dead in a few weeks." That revelation added a new dimension to the betrayal. He hadn't just seen us as obstacles. He had seen us as his financial lifesaver. Our death was not just convenient for him. It was absolutely necessary for his survival. "And what will happen to our grandchildren?" I asked, feeling a new wave of pain at the thought of Damien and Melissa's innocent children. "Social services will take temporary custody of them," the detective replied gently. "But as I understand it, you could apply for custody once you recover from your injuries." The idea of raising the children of our own murderers was overwhelming, but it was also the only way to ensure that something good would come out of this nightmare. Those children were innocent, and they deserved a chance to grow up in a home where love was real, not feigned. "It's time," the detective announced when an officer entered the room with papers in hand. "The warrants are signed. We're going to arrest them now." Through the window of my room that overlooked the hospital parking lot, I could see police officers discreetly positioning themselves. The moment I had been waiting for 25 years had finally arrived. "Damien Black and Melissa Black," I heard the firm voice of the officer in charge. "You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Black and the attempted murder of Hilda and Henry Black." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Melissa's hysterical voice. "What are you talking about? We're the victims here. Our in-laws died in an accident." "Ma'am," the officer replied calmly, "your in-laws are alive, and they have provided complete evidence of your crimes." There was a moment of absolute silence, followed by a scream of desperation from Damien. That's impossible. We saw them die. They were dead. His involuntary confession was captured by the police recorders, adding another piece of evidence to their case. Through the radio, I heard Melissa begin to blame Damien. "It was all his idea. I didn't want to do any of this. He forced me." And Damien, in desperation, screamed, "You were the one who suggested the cliff. You planned all of this." In a matter of minutes, the alliance that had lasted for years fell apart as each one tried to save their own skin. Detective Johnson returned to my room an hour later with an expression of satisfaction mixed with sadness. "They're arrested and on their way to the station," he informed me. "They're both trying to blame each other, which only strengthens our case. But there's something else I need to tell you." "What else?" I asked, though I wasn't sure my heart could handle any more revelations. "During the arrest, we found this in your son's backpack," he said, showing me a small digital recorder. "Apparently, he had been recording his conversations with you and your husband for the past few weeks, probably looking for evidence that you suspected something." My blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" The detective sighed. "It means he knew you were starting to discover the truth. The trip to the mountain wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a direct response to your suspicions. In one of the recordings, you can clearly hear Melissa telling him, 'We have to act fast before they go to the police.' The depth of the planning and the coldness of the calculation took my breath away. They hadn't just planned to kill us. They had been monitoring our conversations, evaluating the level of danger we posed to them. We were mice in a maze, and they had been the scientists observing our every move." "There's something else," the detective continued, "that we found in the investigation of his finances. Your son not only owed money to dangerous lenders, but he had also forged your signature on several documents, trying to access your bank accounts. If you had died on that mountain, he would have had immediate access to all your resources." Every new revelation was like another stab. My own son had not only planned to murder me, he had been actively stealing from me, forging my signature, and violating every principle of family trust I had tried to instill in him. "How much money did he steal in total?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "About $50,000 over the last 5 years, the detective replied. "Small amounts that he thought you wouldn't notice, but which, when added up, amount to a significant sum." The money Henry and I had saved over decades of hard work, penny by penny, had been financing our son's life of luxury while he planned our murder. The following days in the hospital were a whirlwind of police interviews, visits from lawyers, and calls from news media that had picked up the story. The local press had titled the case "The Most Horrible Family Betrayal of the Decade," and reporters from all over the country wanted to hear our version of events. My sister Harriet arrived from the neighboring town, crying and hugging me as if she hadn't seen me in decades. "Hilda," she said over and over, "I always knew there was something strange about Damien after Richard's death, but I never imagined he was capable of this." Her words comforted me because they confirmed that my maternal instincts hadn't been completely blind. "And the kids?" I asked about my grandchildren, who were now in the temporary custody of social services. "I saw them yesterday," Harriet replied sadly. "They're confused, asking why their parents can't come home. They're too young to understand what really happened." The lawyer we had hired, the same Albert who had prepared our will, came to see us with news about the legal process. "The case is solid," he assured us, "with the recordings, the confessions during the arrest, and all the financial evidence. It's almost impossible for them to escape significant convictions." But then he added something that chilled me to the bone. "However, they are trying to negotiate a lesser guilty plea by claiming it was a crime of passion, not premeditated." "A crime of passion?" I exclaimed indignantly. "They planned this for weeks, bought special equipment, and chose the perfect place." Albert nodded gravely. "I know, and we have evidence of premeditation, but their lawyers are going to argue that it was a desperate decision made under extreme financial pressure." The idea that they could receive reduced sentences for their crimes filled me with fury. They had murdered Richard. They had tried to murder us. They had stolen our money for years. And now they wanted to present themselves as victims of circumstances. "What can we do to ensure they get what they deserve?" I asked. "Testify," Albert replied simply. "Your testimony, combined with all the evidence, will be crucial for the jury to understand the true nature of these crimes. But I warn you, it's going to be emotionally devastating to face your son in court." He was right. The idea of looking Damien in the eyes during the trial, of listening to his lawyers try to justify the unjustifiable, of publicly reliving every moment of this nightmare, was overwhelming. But it was what I had to do for Richard, for us, and for my grandchildren who deserve to know the truth about their parents. 3 weeks after the arrest, Henry and I were finally able to go home. Our wounds had healed enough to allow us to move, although he still needed crutches, and I had my arm in a sling. The house felt strange, as if it were the set of a play after all the actors had left. Everything was exactly as we had left it on the day of our family outing. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink, the bed was unmade. The flowers Damien had brought me that week were still on the kitchen table, now withered and dead. It was as if time had stopped at the moment our normal lives ended forever. "Do you think we'll ever be happy again?" I asked Henry that first night back as we lay in our familiar bed. He hugged me with his uninjured arm and sighed deeply. "I don't know, Hilda," he said, "but we're alive. We have the truth on our side, and for the first time in 25 years, we don't have to live with secrets." The trial began 6 months later. On the day I had to testify, I looked Damien directly in the eyes for the first time since the arrest. I saw no remorse, no pain. I didn't see the son I had raised. I saw a cold and calculating stranger who had disguised himself as my son for decades. When I finished my testimony, after recounting every horrible detail of our experience, I addressed him directly from the witness stand. "Damien, I don't know who you are, but you are no longer my son. My son died the night you killed Richard, and what has been living in his place for 25 years is a monster that I unwittingly helped raise." The jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Damien guilty of first-degree murder for Richard's death and first-degree attempted murder for what he did to us. Melissa received the same conviction as an accomplice. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, 1 year later, Henry and I have begun the process of formally adopting our grandchildren. They are beautiful and innocent children who deserve a chance to grow up knowing what true love is, not the manipulative and toxic love they received from their biological parents. Every night when I tuck them in, I tell them about their Uncle Richard, the brother they never knew. I tell them about his kindness, his honesty, his dream of being